nerds, what's up? Apparently Szeth's son Vallano actually wore black on the day he was to kill a king. Are you ready for all the differences? See you after the jump. Okay, so if you are a ride or die Sanderson fan, you probably already know what the Way of Kings Prime is. But for many of you who are new to the fandom or don't really know what it is, here's the rundown. The Way of Kings Prime was the first draft of the Stormlight Archive that Brandon Sanderson ever wrote 8 years before the official published version in 2010. So Way of Kings Prime was written in 2002, and it was written at a point in Sanderson's life when he was getting rejected from everything. He was getting rejected from every grad school he was applying to, and all of his works he was sending to agents and publishers were also getting rejected. So he decided to write this for himself. He was writing a book that he wanted to read, the kind of book he wanted to write, to kind of convince himself like why he was doing this and why he loves it so much. So this version that I read, The Way of Kings Prime, was published as a part of his Kickstarter campaign for the leather-bound Way of Kings. But if you are interested in reading or finding out more about The Way of Kings Prime, he does offer it for free in PDF and EPUB forms on his website, and I can leave that link below in the description box so you can check it out if you'd like. I highly recommend you reading his 3-page introduction that he includes in The Way of Kings Prime because it includes a ton of very interesting context for why and when he wrote this novel, and I found it highly compelling. So if nothing else, I highly recommend you download it just to read that introduction. So ultimately, I read this book though, so you don't have to, and I'm going to describe every difference today between the two versions, and let me warn you, it's a lot. So I've organized this video the best way I know how. We're going to start with world building first, then move on to the magic system, then the characters, and then the plot. Now, I've organized this in such a way that if you have already read The Way of Kings Prime and you're not interested in all the differences, you can skip to the end chapter where I will be saying all of my opinions. I'm going to try very hard not to editorialize during the portion that I am explaining the differences. It will just be straight fact. So if you're just interested in my opinion, you can skip towards the end. I will also be sure to put a ton of chapters in this video, so if there are certain characters or circumstances you are more interested in than others, you will be able to skip around and get to the meat of what you're interested in. With that being said, let's jump right into this and get started. I would say journey before destination, but that's not even in this book, so. Okay, we're starting with world building and locations first. We are still set in Roshar, and it is named that in this novel. I will throw up a map here so we can kind of see some similarities and some differences. As you can see, we still have some familiar names, but also some not so familiar names. We still have Elhokar and Dalinar, locations that function in the very same way in Prime as they do in the official version. We have Kaved and Dalinar. We also have Shinover, but in Prime it's called Shinover. So there's an A where the O is. It's important to note that in Prime, we also have a city called Renarin, which has the closest approximation to Urithru. It controls all the Oath Gates. Renarin in Prime is controlled by Elhokar, and all the Oath Gates are functional straight out of the gate. So that was obviously a huge surprise to me, as a huge plot point in Words of Radiance is the Oath Gates, but in here we just start off with them all functional right off the bat. And as they all go to Renarin, similar to how they do in Urithru in our official version, the fact that Elhokar controls Renarin is a big deal, and it is very important in this novel. For historical context, Elhokar controlling Renarin wasn't always the case. It wasn't the case in previous epochs, and some people are nervous about that because one kingdom shouldn't have control over it. It was supposed to be many kingdoms working together. It's important to note that one of our characters in this book mentions a different planet. So Sanderson was already building up to world topping even this earliest version, which I think is very cool. A couple of things to mention before we move on that I just thought were a little bit interesting is that in this version, Dalinar is known as the warrior nation instead of Elhokar. There are also no Parshendi, which I will get to later when we're talking about the plot, but that's obviously a big deal. Otherwise, you can just tell that in the official version, the map is a little bit more filled out. Great, let's move on to nature. Creme posting from Reddit is gonna be shaking because there are no crabs in this book. None to be found anywhere. Creme posting would also be shaking because in the Prime world, they would be called Crom posting. That is correct. Creme is called Crom, and I know I said I wouldn't give any opinions, but that one just hurt me a lot to read. For some reason, Crom, but it functions the exact same way. It is the buildup after a high storm. I should mention that rock buds are a huge part of the scenery still, kind of that wildlife that moves a little bit, or the plant life that moves a little bit, is still a part of it, although it is not described as in depth, and that's pretty much all we really see of that wildlife. I should say there are still high storms, but they can go both directions, which was very disorienting since, again, the direction of the High Storm had a big importance on our plot in the Stormlight Archive as it is officially published. Also, something I found super interesting is that they do not have a weeping. Instead, they have something called the searing, which is 2 weeks with 0 rain, and that is super hot. So I thought that was really interesting. That's like literally the direct opposite of the weeping, and I wonder if a big decision factor of that was because of Kaladin's seasonal depression. So that was pretty interesting. Next up, let's talk Desolations. So there are still returns in Prime, but they are not called Desolations, but rather Storm Shades. Storm Shades are the return of the Kothin, which are shadow creatures that reap a lot of destruction, but we do not know much more about them in Prime as they are described. Which kind of moves us on naturally to religion. Vorinism is still the religion by that name, and it does have a lot of that female-male sort of stuff that they keep separate. So in this book, only females can read and write, and that is still present in this Vorinism. Interestingly enough, it seemed that safe hands were not a thing in Vorinism. It was briefly mentioned at the very beginning of the book that the fashion was to have your left hand covered by a really long piece of fabric, but it seemed less religious and more just like a fashion statement. But then at the very end of the book, I'm talking page 740, Jasnah quickly mentions embarrassment at having her left hand exposed. It's never called a safe hand, but it is the only time being embarrassed by a hand is mentioned at the very end of the book. So I think safe hands were sort of a thing, but it's definitely not really talked about like it is in the official version of Way of Kings. And I don't know if this was connected to Vorinism in the Prime version, but men and women also still eat the different food, spicy versus sweet, and they worship the being called the Almighty. So a lot of very similarities with the Vorinism in this novel. There is also Ellenism, or Ellens, which is a different religion there that popped up just to worship the heralds and is considered bad by both the herald we know in the novel and by Vorinism because they shouldn't be worshipped in that way. Only the Almighty should be worshipped. Speaking of heralds, there are still 10 heralds, which makes sense since we still have 10 orders in Prime. I'm going to throw up a list of the Prime heralds and the official heralds so you can kind of see the similarities and differences between them. I should mention that I do not know all 10 orders from Prime alone. They were not all mentioned, so I only know a few of them. Jezrien is still a Windrunner and kept his name. Nell is still attributed with Justice, although I do not know what his order name was. Videl is still there, but in Prime seems to be ahead of the Elsecallers instead. Palia is similar to Prael, both still Truth Watchers. Again, Celicia and Salash are very similar in name. Taln is still named the same thing and is still a stone word. So you can see that the building blocks here are very similar to the official version. Next, we're going to talk about the hierarchy of our world. So there are no light eyes and dark eyes in Way of Kings Prime, but there is this very complicated citizen versus noble thing where you have like a rank of citizen and a rank of noble, which you don't really see. I mean, that's similar to, the rank of dark eyes and the rank of light eyes, but it's citizen versus noble in this one. So different execution, but functionally the same thing. Interestingly enough, in this world, the Way of Kings as a book in Worlds isn't some book that's like big on philosophy and all that soul searching sort of thing. It is actually just a book that lists out the exact rules of citizens and nobles and how kings should act. It's like a guidebook, a set of rules for nobles and citizens and kings on how they should act. So it's like kind of similar. It was written by a really important king, but it's very widely read in Prime and people get it read to them all the time, and people are just accepted. It's not like some weird thing that just Dalinar likes in this one. Next, let's talk about Shardblades and Plate. There are Shardblades and Shardplate in Prime by those names, and it seems to me that the Shardblades are much more ubiquitous, like a lot more people have them, but don't quote me on that. That's just kind of how it felt. There are some differences between them and some similarities. So the Shardblades are still extremely long swords that are very good swords, but they are much less magical in this version. They don't sever your connection, your soul. So we've seen people get hit by a Shardblade in this one and they're fine. It's just like a bad sword cut, but they are strong enough to cut through like doors and a person. So they are stronger, but not quite the same as the magical Shardblades that we know. Additionally, when they aren't bonded, they're called blanks. And when they get bonded, they adapt to who you are. So they will change length and size and pattern based on who you are. So that is kind of similar to a Knight's Radiant shard blade in the official version, but this is just any regular shard blade. There are no spren. We're gonna talk about that later, but yeah, that's a big difference. I should also mention that you bond it with a stone, and it takes 100 days to bond a shard blade. You have to carry it around for 100 days on your back without being able to disappear it. The interesting thing though is the bonding is connected to the opal on it. So if you take off the opal and put it on another blank, you would still be bonded to that blank, which is kind of interesting. It's not like to the blade itself, it's just to pretty much any shard blade. I will also say it still takes 10 heartbeats to summon a shard blade once you have bonded it. Shard plate still forms to your body, it just is not quite as strong. They quote in the book that it will only take a single hit from a shard blade versus kind of our 3 hits with the crack and the stormlight. The plate does heal itself, but it's never really explained why or how, just that it will eventually regrow. Okay, and that brings us to the end of world building. Next up, we have the magic system. First, there are no spren in this version of Way of Kings, which is obviously very sad since it's most of our favorite characters and lends a lot of the magic to the world. Instead, all of the magic goes through gemstones in this version. What's very interesting is anyone who can use this gemstone-based magic are called awakeners, and the magic they use is awakening, which is interesting obviously because it later gets used in Warbreaker instead of the Stormlight Archive. There are still 10 orders like I mentioned previously, and each order has a different gemstone attached to it from what I can tell. Again, we didn't really get a list out of what all of them were. Basically, you have to be touching the gemstone with your order to be able to use your magic. There are 2 different ways you can use or access your magic. One is called seeing your power, and the other is called affecting or using or changing your power. And this will make more sense when I give examples later. The first one, when you just see your power, does not use up the gemstone. The second one, where you affect your power, does use up the gemstone, and if you do that, the gemstone will turn to dust and crumble away. So I'm gonna throw up a chart here with all of the orders that I know of and everything that I know about them, as well as the characters who use them in Way of Kings Prime. So the first order we'll talk about is the Windrunners, and their gemstone is Jade. The person who uses it in this novel is still Kaladin. So his sea power is the ability to see the wind, which means he can kind of see the direction of it. He can see when people exhale or inhale. Functionally in the book, it means that when he's fighting, he can get a sense of where someone's going to move based on the wind patterns he sees. His effect power is to use the wind. So he makes the wind push on him so he can move a little faster. He makes wind fill sails to make the ships move faster or to make them roll out of the way. So you kind of see the difference. So just seeing the wind doesn't use up the gemstone, but when he uses the wind to push on him, it does use up the gemstone. He cannot fly in this. It's very different, but it's obviously related to wind still, and you can kind of see how it eventually becomes the actual power in the official version. The next order is Elseschallers, and I'm pretty sure their gemstone is opal. The interesting thing is that Shallan is an Elsechaller in this novel, and I'm not really sure the difference between her sea power and her effect power, but it has something to do with the oath gates. She can override the locking of oath gates, and I'm not sure if that's just her seeing the power or affecting the power. It's never really clear. The next is Stonewards. I have no idea what gemstone they are attached to, if one at all. And the person who uses this is Taln. He is a main character, which we'll talk about later. His sea power is that he can hear where stone goes, so he can't get lost, but I have no idea what his effect power would be. I think it's broken in this novel from what I can tell, and we'll get to that later. The next order is the Onyx Seers, and their gemstone is Onyx, and the person who is using this power is Renarin, and it's clearly the beginning of a Truth Watcher, just with a different name. His is interesting because his sea power is to see into the future. Seeing into the future is not an evil power in this one. They use glyphs, so he would just be writing frantically, very reminiscent of perhaps Taravangian and the plan. It's not called the plan. How am I totally blanking on what that is called right now? It's not the plan, it's the prophecy. Oh my gosh, that's gonna drive me crazy. The temple, oh my gosh. Okay, well, it's similar to that. He writes a ton of glyphs and a ton of numbers and can kind of understand what they mean to see the future. His effect power is to try to influence the future or see too far and see what he should not see, and that will become a very important part of our plot when we talk about it. The next one is, I don't know what order. I think the gemstone is Ruby, but it is Jasnah who can use this power. She seems to be able to hear soul tones, which we don't know a ton about, but she can hear this tone of everything around her, and then she set things on fire. So I'm assuming that's her effect power, but again, I didn't know enough about this one to really be sure. And then finally, the Order of Dustbringers is mentioned by Taln, but we don't see anyone use their powers and know nothing about it. So we only hear of 5 orders in Prime, which is Windrunners, Elsecaller, Stonewards, Onyxeers, and Dustbringers. Obviously, you can see how many similarities there are between what we have in Prime and what ends up being in the official version. I thought it was very interesting that Shallan was originally called an Elsecaller, particularly because I'm an Elsecaller, and I'm very glad it's related to Jasnah, because Jasnah's one of my favorite characters, but I found that interesting. Another thing to note is that I personally feel that the magic in this version, or Prime, has a way steeper cost. It is extremely painful to use their magic, even when they're just seeing it. Kaladin in particular will talk about the pain that the gemstone bracelet gives him, and when he finally affects or uses his power and it fades away, that pain stays with him for days. Also, there are awakeners in this world that are known awakeners, and they function a lot like soul casters, and in the way that they start turning into the material that they can affect, very reminiscent of those soul casters, and they become way less human, their eyes change, they don't move correctly, and it is implied that Shallan and Kaladin and Jasnah and Renarin, anyone who can use his powers will also turn into that. So it's not like the Knights Radiance who don't do that, only people who use the devices. So that seems like a much steeper cost for our heroes. It should also be noted that people fear all Awakeners like they fear the Soulcasters in the official version. So anyone who has this power sometimes wants to hide it because they are very feared. Okay, now we're gonna move on to the characters. I wasn't sure whether to do this before or after the plot, but I think you do need some context about how the characters have changed for the plot to make sense. So let's start right off with Kaladin, and in this novel, Kaladin's name is Merrin. The biggest difference between Merrin and Kaladin is that Merrin does not suffer from depression. This is obviously a huge difference and makes the characters almost very difficult to compare because their story arcs become completely different. There are some hints that Merrin has the leadership abilities of Kaladin, but they are not fully realized at all. In fact, Merrin's arc is completely different from Kaladin's because Merrin's arc is going to completely focus on going from citizen to noble and finding his nobility and finding his ability to lead, which, like, when you consider Kaladin and Moash's journey in Words of Radiance, just completely different. In case you were wondering, Merrin still hates horses, just like Kaladin, and he still was a spearman, but he shows none of like the finesse Kaladin did. They don't necessarily talk about he was like so amazing, but he was one. Merrin also apparently has a ton of brothers, whereas Kaladin only had one and then eventually 2. And we don't hear anything about them, so I know nothing more. But in this version, his parents still don't understand him, so at least that's the same. Next, we're gonna talk about Taln, who is a major viewpoint in Way of Kings Prime, which is obviously extremely different than in the official version. He is one of the main characters in this, and his interesting story is that he believes he is a herald, but you're not sure if he's telling the truth or not because he has lost his powers. So his story really revolves around everyone else thinking he has madness, but him knowing himself to be a herald and kind of what that does. He also considers himself to be the least of the heralds. Now, I don't know what the other heralds think of him, but that is a little different when we consider Way of Kings, the official version, or just the Stormlight Archive, where Taln is pretty much the man when it comes to the heralds. I do notice that Taln has a lot of the official Kaladin characteristics. He's an extremely charismatic leader and people want to follow him, and he's also an excellent fighter. So I do feel like Sanderson rolled some of these Taln personalities into Kaladin when he realized that Taln would not be a main character. Let's move on to Shallan. Shallan is named Shinri in this version, and she still blushes a lot. But in fairness, Merrin and Jasnah spend a lot of time blushing too, so just everyone's spending a lot of time blushing in this book. Shallan is not an artist at all. Again, like Kaladin's depression, it feels very hard to compare those two characters because art is such a big portion of who Shallan is. She is a very good singer though in Prime. Also, from what we know, Shinri does not have any of the past trauma that Shallan has gone through. She definitely does have a strained relationship with her father, but not in the same way that we see with Shallan in the official version. We also don't see Shinri having any sort of crisis of identity or bleeding of identity the way Shallan does. That's just not present. The only thing we really see in Shinri that kind of relates to Shallan is that she doesn't like perfect things, so she destroys things. She will pick threads out of her clothing. She will crack pieces of pottery. She will slightly ruin embroidery, anything so things aren't perfect. And it doesn't really come to much of anything in this novel, but I do see that as a maybe starting point for some of Shallan's future personality traits. Let's talk Jasnah. Jasnah is a very main viewpoint in this novel, even more so than in WoK Prime. We mostly see Jasnah from Shallan's point of view in the official version, but in this one, she is one of 3 very main viewpoint characters. She's sort of similar, but very different. People say that she is very commanding and heartless and a great tactician, but she is not a scholar in this version. Instead, in this version, she is very good at womanly courtly intrigue and very good at battle planning and strategy, but there's no scholar there, which obviously feels very different. The other thing is that most of Jasnah's storylines revolve around men in this story, which is very different from the official version of Way of Kings. And she also has a romance in this story. Again, very, very different from the official version. Basically in this version, in my opinion, I'm not supposed to give a lot of opinion, I think this is kind of fact, she's just a lot less commanding and sure of herself in Way of Kings Prime than she eventually becomes as a fully grown kind of individual in the official Way of Kings. Another just kind of like throwaway line that I thought was very interesting is it's briefly mentioned that Jasnah was Gavilar's favorite kid. Like he vastly preferred her to Elhokar, which I think is very interesting because based on the prologue and Rhythm of War, it seems that is definitely not the case in the official version. I can't say for sure, but I thought that was an interesting line. Let's move on to Dalinar. So in this one, Dalinar is still Dalinar, but it's spelled with an E instead of an I, which is extremely upsetting. And I know it shouldn't be, but it upset me every time I read it. He also still has a Shardblade named Oathbringer. I think Dalinar is one of the characters who is the most similar in personality traits to his official version. He's a very serious, honor-bound person who wants to do things very much the traditional way and is kind. He was not known as the Blackthorn, but rather as the Tyrant Bane in the past. But interestingly enough, I think it must not have been as brutal because everyone still really supports him and is on his side and wants him to be king instead of Elhokar, which is obviously a plot point that's in the official version, but it's more like, oh, you could just kill everyone and take the throne. But there isn't that same sort of energy. I don't know what Sanderson at this time was planning for Dalinar's past, but it doesn't seem nearly as brutal since people all still support him. He is a widower, but from what I can tell, did not kill his wife. I mean, he remembers his wife completely. He also has 3 sons instead of just 2. He has an older son that was killed at the same time that Gavilar was killed. And then he has Adolin and Renarin still. He also has an extra brother. Gavilar is not his only brother. He has another brother who I don't think we ever hear the name of, but it gives him an extra nephew named Jasnah, who does become important later in the plot. I also literally almost forgot to say that he is betrothed to a 14-year-old in this novel, which I will have a lot of opinion on and I will come back and talk to later, but it basically has literally 0 bearing on the plot, so you can forget about it for now. Next up, Renarin. Renarin is still named Renarin in this version, and he is pretty similar, I would say, to his final personality. He's more in the action in this one though, more of a primary character. He maybe is considered a little bit weirder. Like everyone's always like, oh, Renarin, he's so weird. He's so introverted. Like what a weird kid. So that energy is still there. I think it's much more refined in the official version with his characteristics, but that kind of energy is there. He is an Onyx Seer, which is very similar to Truthwatcher, though he can just see the future. He does not seem shy about using his abilities later on in the novel, but we're not really sure how he discovered them. What's interesting enough is that in this version, Dalinar hasn't othered Renarin. Like, in my opinion, there's not this huge favoritism towards Adolin that we see in the official version. That's just not really a part of it. It seems much more equal. And in fact, Dalinar comes to Renarin's defense earlier on than we really see in the official version. Next up, Adolin. Adolin in this version is called Eredor, and there's not much to say about him. He's still the happy, upbeat, really nice and kind person. Pretty similar, not a lot to say. Next up is Szeth. Or shall I say, Jek's son Villano, Truthless of Shinavar. Yep, I had to read that like 8,000 times in this book, and it just was wrong enough to be upsetting. But Szeth's name is Jek in this one, but he still has the son Villano, Truthless of Shinavar instead of Shinover. So that's just very interesting. He functions similarly in some ways. He still has this oath stone, and he's still bonded to the Taravangian character and doing his bidding, but he is just a regular assassin in this one. He has no magic powers. He's just a very good Shin assassin. I also find his character to be different. I feel like he's less conflicted as a character. Like, there is still some of it, but it's not quite as much drudgery. It's not quite as much upset. We also have no idea why he's truthless. It's never explained, and based on some context clues, I don't think it's for the same reason. I don't think it's because he thinks like the Desolations are coming back. It must be for something else, because it seems like the Shin had claimed that was happening, so we don't know why or really explained why he's truthless. Taravangian. In this book, Taravangian is known as King Avon or the Idiot King. You can kind of see some similarities there, that they are both considered maybe not as smart as they actually are. In this one, it is not a curse though. What it is that King Avon is deaf and people do not know it. So for the first part of the novel, he pretends to be very stupid, and he's been doing that for years. So everyone thinks that he is a puppet of his advisor. This is actually not true, and he's a very cunning person who has just pretended to be this way so that he could attack and jump on the opportunity later to basically take over all of Roshar. So he is mute, so that means he can only read lips, and he has put an affectation on his voice to sound slow and dumb, and then later he takes it off and claims that the Almighty has healed him to become a great king. Similar things is that he uses, in this case, onyx seers to see the future, and he has 3 of them, and he uses them to make plans that he knows more than everybody else. So that's similar in nature, but in this novel, Taravangian is way more brutal. King Avon, like, I know Taravangian isn't a good guy in the original one, but in this one it's like pretty brutal for no reason, just like indiscriminately killing children. So just a very different vibe. Next up, Elhokar, who is still called Elhokar in this novel. I say he's much worse in this novel. He's much more conniving, and he does a lot more evil things, where like in the official Way of Kings, I know he's not a great guy, but it's more of like more neglectful than like really evil necessarily. Like, he's just a crappy king. In this one, like, he actively is crappy, so I just feel it's a little different. Some other random things to clear this up. Gavilar is called Nalhalrin? Whatever. You guys haven't read this, you can't tell me I'm pronouncing it wrong. We don't know anything about him, so he doesn't get his own section in this. Shallan, Kaladin, and Renarin are all 17 in this novel, which is different than the official version. I believe Shallan is 2 years younger than Kaladin, and Renarin is 1 year younger than Kaladin, which I think in Way of Kings, the official version, would put them at 17, 18, and 19 respectively, but don't quote me on that. I don't really know. One of the new characters introduced in Way of Kings Prime that has no counterpart is named Meridus. I would say literarily, he's functionally kind of like Sadeas. They are not similar at all in their backgrounds. Like, I wouldn't call Meridus Sadeas because they're not similar enough, but functional wise, Meridus is like the antagonist, the person that's just really easy to hate and isn't necessarily the big bad of the whole novel, but is just like very obnoxious the entire novel. The biggest difference being that Sadeas was really there to annoy Dalinar and Kaladin, and in this book, Meridus is here to mostly annoy Jasnah and Taln. Also, the original series was named Dawnshard, not Stormlight Archive. That wraps up all of the things you need to know about the characters. Let's move on to the plot. A quick note before we jump into the plot is that I will be using the official character names for the people in this so that you can follow it easier. So for example, even though in this version Kaladin is named as Marin, I am going to use the name Kaladin as I describe the plot to help people who have not read Prime kind of keep up and understand the moving pieces just a little bit easier. If a character has no counterpart in the official version, then I will just use their name as it is in Prime. I apologize, in this version I'm going to be reading a little bit more from my notes just to make sure I do not miss anything. So first up, we open up on a battle scene from Dalinar's perspective. Renarin, Adolin, and Jasnah are all there, and with Elhokar, and we are in a battle to avenge King Gavilar. That is Elhokar's goal. But in this case, instead of the Parshendi, it is against a lord who turned traitor. They just call him the traitor, and he is responsible for killing Dalinar's oldest son and King Gavilar. It's very important to Elhokar to kill this man personally. Here we are also introduced to Meridus, which is Elhokar's one of his right-hand man, and he is just a wealthy merchant, not necessarily a noble of the same caliber as Elhokar or our other main characters. Elhokar sees some Shardbearers that he thinks include the traitor, so he rides out to attempt to kill him, but they do not follow the protocol, and one nameless Shardbearer that they do not know comes out to try to kill Elhokar, where he is saved by a lowly spearman who kills the nameless Shardbearer and saves Elhokar's life. So we know this story, Kaladin did it, but in this version, Kaladin keeps the Shardblade the entire novel. Psych! Which is just, it's shocking. But Kaladin kills it and gets his Shardblade and is just happy the rest of the novel. Meanwhile, Renarin makes a really bad decision on the battlefield as they have left him in charge when they probably shouldn't have because he doesn't really know about battle tactics, which leads to a lot of Elhokar forces being destroyed and in the process having the traitor be killed by someone else's hands. There's also some weird thing with this battle where they think maybe a third force was included, but we don't really get to hear the end of that. Either way, the traitor is dead and Elhokar did not kill him. He blames Renarin for this and is extremely angry and strips Renarin of his position and takes away his Shardblade. This makes Dalinar extremely angry. He thinks it's very unfair, and that's kind of the tensions that are going down. Dalinar is considered to be one of King Elhokar's Parshin, which means his right-hand man. He has two, his other being his cousin Jasnah, which is the son of the unknown third brother that I talked about previously. Either way, the war is finally over after several years, and they're all going to return to Renarin, which is kind of like the Urithiru, like I said, through the portals and kind of go home and throw a big party or whatever. So yeah, they return to the Oath Gates because that's like no big deal in this novel. They just get to fast travel immediately. A couple of things are happening from a few different perspectives here. First, Kaladin with his Shardblade. He's now a noble and Dalinar just welcomes him into the house as a Colin. So he's known as Merrin Colin or Kaladin Colin in this case, and gets to wear Colin blue and is just like buddies now with Adolin and Renarin as he learns to be a noble from being a citizen. He also decides to unconventionally train under a swordmaster that is not meant for nobles, and he chooses him. It's kind of a long story, doesn't really matter, but someone to train him in the sword, and his swordmaster's name is Vasher. So that's kind of like a fun and weird connection, since it's obviously like not Vasher, but he's named Vasher, so anyway, I liked that. We also meet Shallan, who is already Jasnah's ward, and has been for 4 years since she was 13 years old. So there goes Shallan's entire plotline in Way of Kings, the official version. But yeah, so that's crazy there. She's just already her ward. And it actually wasn't because Shallan had sought her out. It was a political move that she just got to be Jasnah's ward. Shallan is very excited to be back from the war. She wants to see the person she's been betrothed to for 2 years that she does not get to see very often, but finds out that he is dead from very mysterious circumstances. So a lot of her plotline over the novel is trying to figure out the mysterious circumstances in which her betrothed died. Jasnah is trying to protect her brother from outside threats, particularly assassination, because she thinks an assassination plot will be gone against him. She mostly does this through like the womanly arts of court intrigue and is trying to figure out, but she's lost a lot of status as she's been away at war. She's also fighting with her sister-in-law, Elhokar's wife, because Jasnah and Elhokar's mother is very sick and is in a coma, and she's the reigning matriarch of the family right now, and so she has the power to betroth Jasnah to whoever they want. But if the mother dies, then that power goes to Elhokar's wife. And Elhokar's wife really wants to betroth Jasnah for a political move, and Jasnah doesn't want that. Jasnah is also hiding that she is an awakener. No one knows that she is an awakener, but she is, and that's something she's hidden and tried to tamp down her whole life. At this point, we get a Taln perspective. He has come to be awake and believes he is a herald and believes he has returned and a desolation must be coming. So he goes to Renarin to warn everybody about this. He arrives during a big feast that Elhokar is throwing and makes this big proclamation and tries to make his powers to give like a sign, which consequently doesn't work. He has lost his powers and he has no idea why. So he is considered mad and is given to the monks to be taken care of, and he is mostly taken care of by a character named Lon. His Shardblade is also taken from him, which is like an important plot point that I probably won't talk a lot by, but he tries to get it back the whole novel. Jasnah discovers a plot on Elhokar's life set up by their cousin Jasnah and does everything she can to stop it in its tracks. Kaladin and Adolin are also a part of this. They fend off the attackers, and this is where Kaladin first realizes that he has these weird special powers, pretty much. He doesn't know that it's connected to Jade, so he has no idea what's going on, but he does call upon them because he accidentally brushes a glyph ward that was set in Jade. After helping to save Elhokar's life from this assassination attempt, she realizes that Elhokar and his wife set this up to make it look like Jasnah was trying to assassinate him, but it was all fake and just a plot so Elhokar could go to war against Jasnah, which he has been disagreeing with recently. Jasnah is horrified and Elhokar kills some people important to her who knew about this. to keep the secret, and it makes Jasnah really mad and question why she's been trying to help Elhokar so much. At this point, Jasnah and Elhokar's mother dies. We can't really tell if it's mysterious circumstances or not, but either way, Elhokar's wife gets to betroth Jasnah, and she announces it immediately, and she betroths Jasnah to Meridus, which is Elhokar's right-hand man and now his new Parshin now that they're going to war against Jasnah. Obviously, Jasnah is extremely upset because she hates Meridus and he's kind of the worst. But basically, this is setting up that now, after this huge long war against the traitor, Elhokar is going to be in a civil war, King Elhokar versus his cousin Jasnah. During all of this, Shallan is captured and kidnapped in this feast and is taken back, and it turns out she's kind of kidnapped by her father to be a wife to Taravangian to consolidate Veden power. There's been this whole civil war in Vedenar where Jaqavet is trying to take over. Ultimately, how it all shakes out is that Taravangian is king over a lot of the Veden areas, and this will kind of consolidate his power, and it's his goal to take over all of Roshar. At some point, Shallan figures out that the nameless shard bearer who went to try to kill King Elhokar was actually her betrothed. She didn't realize that he had committed treason, she had no idea why he would do that, and Taravangian explains that his sister, which happens to be Elhokar's wife, is who her betrothed was actually in love with. So he thought if he could kill Elhokar, that he would get Elhokar's wife, and Taravangian convinced him to do this because he just needed people out of the way. So obviously that's very upsetting for Shallan. Dalinar says he will not go to war with or against either of his nephews, that they are going to stay neutral in this conflict, which makes both Elhokar and Jasnah kind of mad. Adolin decides to sneak away against his father's order to go see Jasnah because he's convinced that Jasnah would never try to assassinate King Elhokar, and he thinks something is up. This makes Dalinar really upset because this is a big deal in Prime. He may have to denounce Adolin and no longer have him be in line for the throne. And so it's very upsetting because he loves his son a lot. Shallan is then married to Taravangian against her will, and there's basically a rape scene, but maybe not. Anyway, I said I wouldn't editorialize here, so that's all I'm gonna say about it for now. Kaladin decides to go to some Awakeners who are known for being Onyx Seers and that they can see the future. And so he wants to know what's going to happen to Adolin because Kaladin and Renarin are very, very worried about what's happening. They go there and Renarin takes over because he's these people aren't very good. And he reveals that he is this Onyx Seer to Kaladin. And in the future, he sees that Adolin is going to die. That freaks Kaladin out a ton. And so he convinces Renarin for them to go after Adolin to try and save him. This is obviously very upsetting to Dalinar because now basically both of his living sons and someone he trusted have left without his knowledge, and it makes him seem weak, and there's all these consequences for going against his edict that he's worried about having to enforce. Next, Taravangian makes a move on Ral Aram to take it over, and he does it in a way that basically kills every single person in the palace in order to not tip off Elhokar that they are taking that over, because that's going to be their move before they go and completely wipe out Elhokar. This was only possible because he somehow knew that Shallan had the power to forcibly open oath gates even if they were locked from the other side. So he forces Shallan to do that, and she didn't even know she could do it, so that's her realization that she has this power that she didn't know she had, which is clearly related to being an Elf Scholar, but we don't know much more than that. Jasnah, Taln, and Meridus managed to escape this attack on Ral Aram, and they escape under some tunnels that only Taln knew about. And so now they are on the run, and it is their goal to go warn King Elhokar that this unknown force is coming for them while they're having a civil war and is going to take them unawares. Taln also negotiates to make them go see this random holy city that's kind of out of the way, but he's convinced all the other heralds are gathered there because his sword can tell him where the other heralds are, and he really wants to know what's going on and why his powers aren't working. After a bit of a journey, Kaladin and Renarin finally reach Jasnah and where he is, and they find out that the war is over and they have already all been defeated, and they see Adolin's head on a spike. So yeah, that's different. And then they are captured and brought back to Ral Aram. Taravangian tells Shallan to fake a pregnancy and then a miscarriage because he is worried that Shallan's dad will try to kill him once they have an heir so that they have a reason to the throne, but they also have to seem like they are trying. A messenger tells Dalinar that Adolin is dead, and he also assumes that Kaladin and Renarin are probably dead since they've been gone for so long, and Dalinar decides that it is time for him to go to war against King Elhokar because this is messed up. And so he rides to start another civil war with an Elhokar. Back to Jasnah, Taln, and Meredith, who are still making their way across this long journey because they know all their messengers will be killed, and so they're trying to deliver this message that Taravangian is going to attack everything. But they have basically amassed an army because everybody is convinced Taln is a herald, and they follow him, and he's like super charismatic. And eventually, though, Taln has to leave to save the group because they are being followed by Taravangian's troops, and so Taln leaves to presumably try to take care of that. Shallan is also at Rel Aram, and she helps Kaladin and Renarin escape. Renarin kind of helps them escape by doing a bunch of Onyx seeing and seeing the future. They also realize they were all born at the very same time, and they're all 17 years old, and they all have these powers, so they think something must have happened 17 years ago to cause this. At the Oath Gates, once they escape, Shallan wants to go a different way and go seek refuge with a king who said that she could always come back after she'd been there as a child. But Kaladin and Renarin forcibly take her into Veden territory, where Renarin thinks they must go to save everybody because of his Onyx scene, and that makes Shallan very angry that she is forced to come through. Dalinar and Elhokar's forces clash now by being watched by Taravangian from afar. He's waiting to see when they can kind of wipe them out. Renarin is such a powerful seer that it is starting to interfere with Taravangian's seers, and so he's less sure of the outcomes of things. Okay, so the new city that Kaladin et al. Go to is run by a bunch of regents because this land was conquered by Vedenar a while ago and they've never resisted. So Kaladin goes to try to tell these regents that they should not send all of these powerful ships they have that Taravangian was going to use to further trap Elhokar in his battle, and instead give them to their side so they can defeat Taravangian. And the regents are like, we can't do that. There's all these Veden shard bearers on the ships. So then Kaladin's like, well, if I can defeat all of them in a duel, so like an official duel, then will you let us? And they're like, sure. So he goes to duel the shard bearers, but they don't play nice, and they all attack him at once, and he defeats all 5 of them using his power of the wind, and it's a big deal. And so they commandeer all the ships, and so they can instead sail to Elhokar to save them instead of bringing this terrible force. Part of this that's also important is Kaladin gives Shardblades to everybody. Like, he re-gives a Shardblade to Renarin and to this other random dude who helped him, and it becomes his like vassal. So now it's like Kaladin being like, I am a noble. Now I have people like under me who depend on me. So that's kind of like an interesting plot point. Also, at this point, Shallan tricks Kaladin into letting her leave and go to that kingdom that she wanted to go to. Even though Taln is missing, Jasnah and Meredith still stop by the Holy City because Jasnah makes Meredith, even though he doesn't want to. And then Jasnah finds out that Meredith is just going to sell their army to this despot king to get rid of them. And she's really upset. And they're like, well, Taln is dead. He hasn't come back and it's been weeks. But then Taln shows up and it's happy and he saved them all. And Taln is like, all the other heralds are here. So he makes a deal with the despot king to save their little army. And then he goes to find the heralds. And instead of finding heralds, all he finds is all of their swords buried, which makes him think they are dead for good and not ever coming back, because otherwise they'd be with their bodies. Taln is very upset, but Jasnah starts to think that maybe he is mad and not a herald, and he somehow just found this cache of Shardblades, and it's very confusing. And so there's this whole thing where Jasnah has to accept that he might be crazy, and Taln doesn't know if he's crazy. And they have this whole scene where they confess feelings for each other. There's also this side thing where Meredith has thought Jasnah and Taln have been cheating this whole time, even though they haven't, so it's like this big deal. Taln says he can't be with Jasnah because heralds are never allowed to love because it's distracting, so it's like this sad moment where they can't be together, but they really love each other. At the same time, Elhokar's civil war is ensuing, and this is when Taravangian's troops show up and just start decimating them. Back to Jasnah, she realizes Meredith is going to try to get Taln killed during the following battle with Elhokar, and she's really upset about it, so she makes a deal with Meredith that if he does not get Taln killed, she will marry him and stop delaying the wedding. So they get married that very same night, which really upsets Taln, and he's all sad about it too. The battle is really terrible, and Elhokar is really losing, so Navana, which is Elhokar's wife, goes to Taravangian because she's also his sister, and is like, okay, I can see that we're losing. Can you please take me back? Because I have my 3-year-old son here and I really don't want to die. And Taravangian brutally kills her and her son. So that's very pleasant. Okay, so Kaladin is on the water. He's almost there. And then he gets this bad premonition, like something bad has happened. And all of a sudden he's been like, I haven't seen Renarin in a while. So he rushes downstairs to Renarin's quarters and he finds Renarin completely catatonic, basically alive but completely dead. And they realize, they see the onyx in his hand, it's been used. And what we know about onyx seers is if they try to influence the future or see too far, it basically kills them. They're dead but alive. and we've seen that previously in the novel. So Renarin is completely gone because he tried to see too far. Back to the Elhokar and Dalinar have this heart-to-heart about what's going on. They haven't really talked because they were still kind of in this weird civil war, but having to fight together against Taravangian's troops, where Elhokar tells Dalinar that he had to go against Jasnah because Jasnah was claiming that his war against the traitor was unjust and that he had a witness that claimed the traitor never killed his father. This is a thread that I'm guessing would have been more in other books. We don't know more about it here. Dalinar and Elhokar also agree that the Elhokar troops are too separated right now and they need one commander, so Elhokar and Dalinar agree to duel. Initially, Dalinar thinks he's going to let Elhokar kill him for his brother, so that his brother's legacy can live on. And then he's like, psych, I actually love my son more than I love my brother. And so he kills Elhokar and becomes the new king. Okay, back to Jasnah and Taln and Meredith. They finally reach the Elhokar troops. They get invited to dinner for this feast. Jack and Taravangian sneak into this feast because Taravangian has said they need to spy on Jasnah because his Onyx seers have said that she's the key to everything and that Jasnah will either destroy him or he will destroy Jasnah. So he needs to figure out what her weakness is because he just doesn't know what her weakness is. The battle begins the next morning. I should note there's only 25 pages left at this point when this big battle happens. Taravangian realizes that Jasnah must be in love with Taln by the way things play out, and so he sends Jack to assassinate Taln, which he is successful in doing, which completely incapacitates Jasnah and makes her completely worthless in the battle because she is too sad. So Taravangian thinks he has won. But then Kaladin shows up with the fleet that he commandeered, and Taravangian doesn't know it's been commandeered, so he comes behind and they start decimating Taravangian's forces and help save Elhokar. And Kaladin then defeats Jack with like a single blow of air. It sends him tumbling and they capture him. And then Taravangian surrenders. That's like literally the last paragraph of the book. Taravangian being like, I surrender. The end. But then there's an epilogue. And are you ready for this wild ride of an epilogue? So Taln wasn't a herald. It was fake. A brother-in-law shows up with Jasnah, with the body, and Jasnah's all like, well, it hasn't disappeared into smoke. That's what's supposed to happen if he's a real herald. And this guy comes in like, hey, I'm actually his brother-in-law and he has a wife and kids back and this terrible thing happened to us and they all died. And after that, Taln kind of thought he was a herald and he kind of went crazy. And so Jasnah's obviously very sad about this, but decides that she loved him for who he was, whether or not he was a herald. Dalinar still respects Kaladin, but basically blames him for all of his son's deaths and everything that happened. And Kaladin agrees and he's like, I know you'll never be able to kind of see me the same, and I don't want to make you have to demote me, so I'm going to do it myself. And he gives up his Shardblade to Dalinar and says he is no longer a noble, no longer part of House Kholin, and he's going to go back to just being a farmer. Shallan steps into Thaylen, which is the place where the king said he would offer her refuge if she ever needed it because a storm was coming soon. And she gets there, and the king is like, I know I said we were friends, but now I've realized how important you are. You're Taravangian's wife, and you can control the Oath Gates, so sorry, you're not going to be allowed to leave. And Shallan realizes she's walked from one prison into another prison, and she's very sad. We also find out that someone kind of portrayed Jasnah that she didn't know about, came back and pretended like nothing happened. I wish I could have mentioned that more in the plot, but it was just like such a little part. It would have probably been important for another book. We have a scene where Szeth gets away from his captors. No surprise. During the funeral ceremony for Taln, Jasnah reveals she's an awakener to everyone who didn't know it by turning Taln's body to smoke, which is what happens in the Herald stories, and she did it as one last tribute for him. So obviously a lot would go down now that everyone knows she's an awakener. But then, JK, Taln was actually a herald, because the last perspective we hear from is the brother-in-law of Taln, who actually was a herald in disguise. So we don't know much, but those heralds want Taln dead because they think that they would still want to help everybody against these cycles of returns, and they broke their oath pact and don't want to return anymore, so they had to make sure he was dead so they can just go on living their life. And that's how the book ends. I'm not gonna editorialize too much, but as you can tell, it is a much less hopeful and darker ending than most of the Stormlight Archive, and just a lot freer with death. Okay, now we're going into my opinions of this and what I really thought of Way of Kings Prime. And before we really get into it, I do want to talk a little bit about the purpose of Way of King Prime and a little disclaimer. I think it's pretty cool that Sanderson released this copy. I think most of us would feel very protective over something like this, something that wasn't as good as our published work. Like, we wouldn't want people to see that. And in fact, Sanderson himself self-describes this book as a failure. And the fact that he's still willing to put this book out there, I feel like is pretty incredible. The opening line to his introduction in this book is, "This book is both one of my greatest accomplishments and one of my greatest failures." He talks about how in this point of his life he had received so much rejection from grad school, rejection from publishers, and that when he made this, it was like a lifeline for him to tell him, like, yeah, this is what I want to do. And I understand like what an important piece of work this must be to him and how cool it is that he's willing to share that with us, even if he views it as a failure. Because of that, I want to tread lightly when I talk about it. I don't want to just like come up here and like trash this special work. And so I am going to be critical of it, and I am going to talk about some things that I think were unsuccessful and were much more successful in the official Way of Kings, but I want to keep it on a light-hearted note and understand that I'm trying to be positive and not just say things about this, and I understand the purpose of this work, and I feel very grateful that Sanderson released it. Okay, going into it, Sanderson immediately nails in his introduction one of the big problems I see with Way of Kings Prime. So I'm just gonna read his quote. He says, "I'd never attempted something on this scope before, and so I tried to write too many different viewpoints with too many different plot lines for me to juggle. The end result, as you'll read, is a book that lacks focus. It's trying to do too much. What it envisions is awesome, but because of my limited skill at the time, I ended up with a large number of fragments of different stories told together in one book, rather than something that tells a single narrative." This is such an accurate description of how I felt reading The Way of Kings Prime. Of course, all these plot points were building to this final battle, but they all somehow felt so separate. Unlike the official Way of Kings, where everyone kind of has their own storyline, but you clearly see how they intersect, that sort of camaraderie between the plot lines just wasn't there, and I really felt it. Additionally, this problem, I think, is the reason there were so many dropped threads and dropped plot lines. There were so many times where I was like, wait, what happened to that? Like, there would be a character who was super important in the first half that completely almost disappeared in the second half. And it wasn't in a way that's like, oh, this is just setting up for another book. It really felt like dropped plot points. Like, what was the point of introducing that if it had no bearing whatsoever, even maybe on a future book? Some of the characters I really think of this are Dalinar, who I didn't even mention in my plot because of this, where he's kind of like a betrayer who flip-flops between sides. I think he was probably going to be a very important character, but it just kind of felt like so background in this book. Additionally, Lon, who is the monk who helps Taln throughout the whole book, in the first half, like, so active, and then all of a sudden I forgot he existed, because like that's like what happened to him. He didn't go anywhere. Same thing with Dalinar being betrothed to a 14-year-old. Like, that seems it should be a big plot point, and at the beginning you think it will, and it just kind of dissolves into nothing. So it was kind of bizarre. There seemed to be so much going on, but yet almost not enough. It was a very bizarre juxtaposition. In the end, a lot of it felt a little sloppy, which is a word I would never use to describe Sanderson in a million years. When I think about his trilogies like Mistborn or even the Stormlight Archive, he's known for this like tight foreshadowing, all these threads that come together in such an amazing way. So it's very just more interesting to see a novel that doesn't do that well, since it's one of the things I like most about his writing now. Another thing that's a little bit of a victim of this is just pacing. I was very surprised by the pacing of the novel because, again, Sanderson is kind of known as that like fast-paced, everything's happening, bam, 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 and I really didn't feel that in this book. I've mentioned the page numbers in the plot to kind of give a sense of this. Like, this giant battle is coming to a head, and at like 25 pages left, you're like, this should have happened earlier. Like, there was no Sanderlanche. The book ends so suddenly. I don't really feel like I got that like kind of like normal rising action, climax, and dropping action. It just didn't feel that way to me. Next, let's move on to the characters, which is honestly where I have the most complaints in terms of how different it is from the final version. What I like to say is they kind of felt like cardboard cutouts of their counterparts. They look the same, but they are nothing like real people. One of the biggest things I noticed that covers all of the characters as a blanket statement is that Sanderson really told us about the characters rather than showed us. So for example, so many characters would be like, Merrin is such a serious guy, or Jasnah, man, she's a genius and so cold-hearted. But then you'd hear from their perspectives and you're like, Merrin doesn't seem that serious. Jasnah doesn't really act that smart as everyone claims she acts. Like, she kind of makes weird judgments if that's the case. So it was bizarre to always see other characters having to describe the other characters for us rather than their actions just speaking for themselves. I think that's a very, very common thing in early writing, so I don't think that's necessarily a Sanderson thing. I just do find it funny since it definitely does not plague the real Stormlight Archive at all, in my opinion. He was also really bad at describing grief. Like when Shallan finds out that her betrothed is dead, it was kind of hilariously bad. Like she's like, I'm sad, but you didn't feel any of it. Same when Adolin dies, you didn't really feel it. Again, just probably skill in writing. The biggest shock for me came from his treatment of female characters. Now I have to say, the first booktube video I ever made was a video about how much I loved Brandon Sanderson's female characters. I'm very outspoken about it. I love them because I think he finds different ways to make females strong without having to be this fighter archetype, and how he lets his female characters have a lot of femininity to them without taking away from their intelligence or their strength or their fighting ability. Like he just has a big, wide variety. So it was very shocking to see Shallan and Jasnah in this novel not have any of that. Jasnah and Shallan's story points all revolve around men. Jasnah, it's either about her role with Elhokar, with her betrothed, or with her romance. Shallan, it's all about her relationship to her betrothed or to Kaladin and Renarin. Very different from what ends up being their personalities. Although Shallan is immature in a lot of ways, I would never claim that her motivations are just male-driven. Sure, she has brothers that she's trying to save, but it feels very self-motivated. Basically, Jasnah and Shallan, as their final forms, have so much more agency and movement in the story and influencing. I would not feel the same way about Sanderson's characters if this had been the official version. So that was a very stark contrast for me. It was really hard for me to read Jasnah in this version because Jasnah is one of my top favorite characters of the Cosmere. I love pretty much everything about her, and down to her like lack of romance storyline. So it was very, very hard for me to see Jasnah in a romantic subplot, which is silly, I know, but I still felt it. I also felt that they made Jasnah a little silly. She wasn't this commanding presence. Like she had this moment where she'd rather wear a dress than something practical to go hiking in, which is just like, as the Jasnah I know and love, those things were hard for me to read. Honestly, I'm actually curious. If we ever get to go to another signing, if they still do that, you know, sometimes Sanderson lets you ask him questions, and I'd sincerely want to ask, like, what changed between here and even Mistborn, but particularly Stormlight Archive, that changed how you wrote female characters? Was it getting married? He got married in between this and the final one. I actually looked it up. Was it a different writing group who was giving him advice? I have read his Warbreaker annotations, and he talks a little bit about a scene in Warbreaker that he changed because some people felt like it was hurting his female character. It's near the end of the book, so I can't talk about it without spoiling. So I'm like, maybe it was a different writing group. I don't know, but it's such a stark contrast between this book and where he ends up as some of my favorite female characters in all of fantasy that I'd love to know how he got from A to B. Maybe it was just growing up or just continuing writing, but that it's just a very present part of Prime. Another thing I'd like to talk about is this idea of betrothals between old men and young women. I'm actually going to first read what he says about it in the introduction. Also, in reading history, I found that many arranged marriages happened between people of extremely disparate ages, and I wanted to explore that kind of strange relationship. I did it in a way that didn't involve anything uncomfortable happening, but it still came off poorly in the book. Fair warning. I would agree with him on everything he said, except I do think one kind of unsatisfactory thing happened. Not in Dalinar and his 14-year-old's relationship. Nothing unsatisfactorily happened there, but it was handled weird. I kind of agree with him. But between Taravangian and Shallan, I personally read their wedding night scene as a rape scene, and it was pretty upsetting because Shallan was not upset after it, and I was like, I can't believe this just happened. I was also upset because I went on Read by Andy, and I was talking to her about fantasy, and one thing I said is that like Sanderson's my safe space because I know I don't really have to read that stuff that's handled poorly. So it was very shocking to see how this was handled. Later on, it's implied that it was consensual, which is not how this scene read at all, in my opinion. And so I felt like that was handled poorly, like he said. I did not like it at all. I am so, so grateful that he was able to change that. And a testament, I think, to how much he grew as a writer is that that plot point is essentially borrowed for Warbreaker. And Warbreaker is one of my favorite novels of all time. So as upsetting as it was to read it in Prime, it was also cool to see like, hey, you took this same interest in these betrothals and these arranged marriages, and were able to turn to something that I think was not handled well at all to handling it in a way that's one of my favorite books of all time. So that's a positive. But yeah, if you read this book, I'd be surprised. I'd wonder if you were as shocked as I was at the handling of that. Okay, finally, something I found really cool while reading this novel. I'm gonna wax poetic a little bit, maybe get a little cheesy, but I'm gonna say it anyway. Something I noticed is that all of our main characters lacked their struggles. So Merrin does not suffer from depression, right? Our Kaladin character does not suffer from depression. Our Shallan character does not suffer from past trauma and this identity crisis or questioning. Dalinar doesn't have this brutal past that he has to try to overcome and then deal with the hypocrisy of who he is now versus who he was, and on and on and on. None of our characters have kind of their past traumas or struggles or things they may be trying to overcome, or just things that present challenges in their life. And as a consequence, I did not feel connected to any of these characters. As a consequence, they felt very flat and throwaway and less lovable. And I want to use Kaladin as the biggest example, because Kaladin, I think, is one of the most loved characters in all of Sanderson's works. They did like a Reddit poll and he came out flying colors on top. I think there's rarely anyone who doesn't like Kaladin. He's a great character. And it was interesting, this thought, like, Kaladin without his struggle, Kaladin without his depression is not Kaladin. Not that we should ever think our struggles define us, but Kaladin's struggles made him heroic too. It made him who he was. It made us all love him and root for him and connect to him. And this idea that maybe the things we wish we could change most about ourselves, the things that we consider struggles for us, or like those things you're like, why am I this way? Why does it have to be me this way? Are perhaps the same things that make us lovable and successful and heroic and helps us connect to people. Was just a really cool concept. And I know that's a little deep, but I couldn't help thinking of like, these characters without their struggles weren't as easy to connect or weren't as lovable. And the idea of that being true in our own lives, of like the things that we find hardest about ourselves to love may be some of the things that make us the most lovable or easiest to be friends with, was just like a really cool thought I had. And I appreciate how Sanderson, like, that is the way he grew his writing, was by taking away these characters who were so one-dimensional and really putting real things into them that somehow made them more aspirational than just being bland, perfect characters. Overall, I mean, there's a lot I could discuss about this. If you've read it, please let me know. But it's clear that the Way of Kings official version is superior in every single way. I mean, Sanderson says it himself, and I have confirmed it by reading this. However, I think there's a lot of interesting things we can learn from this. The biggest one I was thinking about was like, whatever dream or goal you have, whatever it is, like, just do it for you. Make sure you're doing it for you still. Make the content or write the content or whatever it is that you want to do. Like, that's what Sanderson was doing. He was writing this for himself and no one else. And it was the thing that helped propel him to be successful and eventually get to do what he wanted to do. And I find that very inspiring. And for writers in particular, I think of the answer like, it's okay that your first draft isn't it. It's okay that it's not very good. And the idea that just because you write a failure of a book does not make you a failure as a writer. And it means you probably just need a little bit more practice. There were 8 years between Prime and the official Way of Kings, and the Stormlight Archive has propelled Sanderson into even bigger fame than he was, because he realized he needed to do what he wanted to do. So if you're a writer, write what you want to write. Also know that it may take several drafts, several years, and several tries before you get out what you really want to get out. So, should you read Prime? Maybe is my answer. If you're an aspiring writer and a huge Sanderson fan, I think it could be a good thing to do. I'm not an aspiring writer, and I found that I learned a lot about the writing process simply just reading Prime. I was able to see how he got from point A to point B, and it made me realize why Prime wasn't as successful as the official version, and just being able to see that in such a concrete way, like, taught me about writing, even though I don't really care. So I think it could be a very valuable resource in that way. If you're a huge Sanderson fan who just cannot bear the thought that there's something published of his that you haven't read, go ahead and read it. It probably won't take you very long to go through if you're not taking notes like I was. But otherwise, I don't think it's like this huge necessary thing for people to read. I found it very interesting. I'm glad I did it. I had a lot of fun making this video to help other people kind of see the differences, but I wouldn't say it's some like required piece of Sanderson reading. I would say my video's probably enough for you to know just the differences between it. Overall, the final thing I'd like to say about Prime versus the official version is that it feels like the exact same bricks were given to an amateur and a professional. They were building from the same materials, but the books that finally are produced are just vastly different. So we made it. We made it to the end. I doubt any of you made it here. Let me know in the comment section if you actually listened to this whole video. What was the most interesting difference for you if you haven't read the book and you discovered in my video, or if you had read Prime? Tell me what you thought was the most interesting change, what you thought of the book. I want to hear all your thoughts about this video, about Prime, about the Way of Kings. I'm excited about it. I'll be honest, I really just want to reread The Real Way of Kings now. It reminded me of how much I love that book, and so hopefully I'll have time for that at the end of the year. Anyways, as always, if you like these deep dive kind of videos, the best way you can support me is to subscribe and like this video. And as always, please leave a comment. And if you want to follow me on Instagram to see what I'm currently reading, you can check me out at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.